Hello, everybody. Good to see you guys. Got Eddie here joining me for the first couple minutes, I guess. I don't know if you've seen him before. This is Eddie. I think his sister Peach made an appearance last time. But anyway, yeah, we'll be getting started in about 10 minutes. I'm running the stream, 10 minutes in advance of the 4 o'clock hour. So got a little bit of additional time to work with. If you're watching this on recording later, then you probably want to, I don't know, skip to the 10-minute mark, and then you'll get to the beginning of the lecture content. But I'm just here waiting for people to arrive, and we'll get our meeting started soon. So thank you, guys. What up, Eddie? Oh, yeah. He's really a good guy. He's really such a sweet, cute, funny, weird cat. Eddie. Hello, hi guys. Good to see you. Let's see if I can kind of get the right angle here. Okay. Welcome back. Good to see you, Carson and Elena. Eddie. What's up, Ed? He's just too cute. Hey, buddy. Maybe. What's up, Eddie? Ready to learn? Yeah. Hi there, Jennifer. Welcome back. Just chilling until 4 p.m. and then we'll see. We'll get the actual lecture started. Hello, Santino. Hey, Jen. Told you the cats sometimes make an appearance, so Eddie, he's really showing up today. Good to see you guys. Just another 6 minutes or so. Hey, Justin, good to see you there. This cat is Eddie. Eddie's his name. Yeah, he's a good boy. Saying hi, Eddie. Yep. Hey, Michelle. Everybody seems to be happy to see you, Eddie. Yeah, right. He's a good guy. Anthony, I guess he's taken, but he has a lot of friends, I guess. Hmm. Good boy, Eddie. All right. Another 4.5 minutes, basically. Yeah, he's really a good kitty. He's just wants to hang out, just wants to cuddle and chill. All right, Eddie. I guess he's running off now for the moment. Maybe he'll be back. But anyway, he's a good guy. 1 second, I'm gonna get myself my little canteen of water. I'll be right back. Eddie, already back? Hmm? Down there. Hey, come over here. Oh yeah. Fun kitty. Hello, Mary Jane. Welcome back. Eddie. He's back. Hey, Andrea. Jasmine, welcome. Eddie says hello, I guess. Oh, nice. Ernie, even a sort of similar name. Small world, huh? Hey, Zach, Tyler, Natalia, welcome back, guys. Oh, dude. So we got like 2 minutes, and then I'll get things rolling. Hey, Leanne, good to see you. Hey, Daniel, welcome. Eddie, it's not a very stable position you're in right there. Watch out. You're gonna knock something over. Okay, just another few seconds here and I'll get our lecture meeting underway. Oh, there he goes. All right. Good to see you, Betty. Welcome, back again. I'm glad that you're doing well and finishing your degree. So yeah, and I did great. So once in a while, we do get some of my former students just looking at the live stream. Julian, good to see you too. Okay, guys, so we're pretty much now at 4 p.m. Therefore, I'm going to get us underway. Welcome back, and I hope you all had a good weekend and that this week is off to a nice start. If you're here in the chat, feel free to drop a little message, say hello. I kind of have an informal way of keeping attendance through that. So, yeah, let me know if you're here. I think most of you already said something, but anyways, good. So, I think we basically last time spent most of the meeting on the moral philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and we have almost all of that done, but there's like one last concept. Let me ask anybody that's here. Wasn't it that when we were finishing, we talked about the categorical imperative, but we just talked about the first version of it? Or did we briefly mention the second version about means and ends? Gemmin, you're asking, is there no in-person office hour? I've told you this before. I have office hours that are by Zoom, but they're also physical office hours, and they're in H311A. If you want to go to the Humanities building on the third floor, that's where my office is, from 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. on Mondays, but I'm also running a Zoom at the same time. Yeah, so my question, though. Last time when we were in our meeting, we briefly went over the second version of the categorical imperative. Okay, so I'm just going to do a little brief summary of the overall topic of last lecture, and then we're going to move into a new author today. We're going to start learning about the moral debate concerning the abortion issue. So, okay, Immanuel Kant, another important moral philosopher that kind of wrote about ethical theory in addition to John Stuart Mill. We started the class by learning about the utilitarian ethical theory of Mill that said that you should always take the action that causes the most overall happiness for the greatest number of people. After that, we learned about Kant. So Kant's moral philosophy does not base itself on the consequences that result from your actions. So it's not a consequentialist moral theory. Instead, it is known as a deontological moral theory, which means that it centers around the concept of duty. And he basically says that rather than considering whether the action promotes the best consequences or generates the most overall happiness, you should rather consider the will or the intention of the agent that did the action. So what does it mean to act with a good will? Kant has a very detailed specification of what that means. He says that you act with a good will when you act out of a feeling of duty to uphold or abide by the moral law. So rational beings, humans basically, persons, can act out of a feeling of duty to uphold the moral law. He says that the goodwill is the centerpiece of his ethical theory because, according to his view and based on his argument, it's the only thing in the world that's unconditionally good. He lists other character traits that are sometimes thought praiseworthy or desirable, but he says that none of these other traits are unconditionally good. They're only good certain conditions, but not others. For example, intelligence, being dedicated or hardworking, having charisma or humor or, I don't know, courage. These are all good in some certain scenarios, but they can also be turned into a bad quality if the person who holds the quality has a bad intention or a bad will. So we should therefore always be trying our best to act according to a sense of duty to abide by the moral law. And when we do that, we have a goodwill. A goodwill is good in all circumstances, unlike, say, intelligence that, if possessed by an evil person with bad intentions, can simply give them a greater capacity to do terrible things. So we should try to maintain and upstand within ourselves a goodwill. Now, he furthermore said that an action only has moral worth if it's done from the motive of duty. And on the other hand, if it's done from the motive of inclination, then it lacks all moral value or worth. The concept of inclination is just when you do something out of a personal desire or want to do it, often for the sake of your own happiness or pleasure. And he tries to distinguish the two motives through this shopkeeper example that was mentioned. In the shopkeeper case, we were told about a case where, say there's a shopkeeper who could sell a good to a customer, but this is, let's say, a young, inexperienced person that's asking for the price of something. Suppose that he's tempted by the possibility of overcharging the young person, basically inflating the cost so that he can get additional revenue, but he knows that that's unfair and wrong. So even though he feels like ripping the kid off, he still gives him the fair price because he recognizes his duty to abide by the right moral principle. In another version of the case, we can imagine that the shopkeeper gives the fair price, but does it automatically out of love, or maybe out of fear that if he doesn't do so, then he could get caught and exposed as, a fraudulent business person. But in these other cases, it's not done strictly from the sake of duty. It's done for some kind of inclination-based reason because it's bound up with his own self-interest. So Kant says that the clearest case of acting with the motive of duty is when you're disinclined to do the right thing, but duty calls kind of, and you're going to hold yourself to that moral standard regardless of how you feel. After that, we said that the duty we have, of course, is to act towards upholding the moral law. But what is the moral law, and how could we possibly know what it is? Kant says that we can use reason to discover the content of the moral law. And when we do that, we'll focus our mind on this principle, which he calls the categorical imperative. Now, does anybody here think that they can remember or recall the first version of the categorical imperative? I just want to review that briefly. One version of the categorical imperative, the first one, it says that you should only act in what certain type of way. Let me know what you guys think. And welcome to all those here in attendance. It's great to see you guys, as always. But yeah, do let me know. Version 1 of the categorical imperative says basically, if you could, I don't know how you can express it, but you can say it in your own way or in a very formal way. Hi, Amanda. Let's see it in the chat if you can get that. Act always so the maxim which describes your action could be willed to be a universal law. And Jemin, I like your succinct way of putting it as well. The action must be capable of being universalized. Okay, so let me break that down just one more time. Kant says, consider the principle that you're acting on, and that's known as your maxim. A maxim is like a principle that says what actions someone would do under what conditions. So we then ask ourselves when we commit the action, or we're contemplating it, whether it would be possible or not undesirable for all to act according to that principle as though it was a universal law. So if my action that I'm thinking of doing is not paying the subway when I ride, then I would be acting on a maxim that says none will pay when they ride the subway. And if that was the case, the subway system would cease to exist because it would be denied funding that it needs to operate. So that's a maxim that can't possibly be universalized without contradiction, and therefore the act is wrong. Another possible case, suppose that I never want to help anyone in my life. So my maxim is, when others are in need, I will not help them. If this was universalized, it would be the maxim that none will help anyone when they're in need. And that kind of, it's not a logical contradiction because it's not impossible for that state of affairs to exist, but it's an undesirable status quo. I also use the cutting line example, Jemin, yes. If everybody cuts the line, there's no longer any line to cut. And furthermore, the cutter, he or she or they don't want all people to cut, because if all of them did, then what would be the point of their own act of cutting? They would rather hope that other people will act according to the ordinary rules of the line, so that when they violate the rule, they'll gain an advantage over all the other people that are following the rule. So there's different ways to give examples, but he also uses this case of, he talked about a person that's in need of money and wants to borrow money from somebody, but they have to promise to pay it back so that they'll even give it to them. But if they don't intend to pay it back, then their maxim can't be universalized either, because if every borrower acted on the principle that I will promise to repay a loan and I won't pay it, then the whole lending system would no longer exist either. So one way of thinking about your moral obligations and the moral law, says Kant, is to just use reason and to contemplate whether the action principle you're acting on is one that could at least conceivably be done by all. And if it couldn't be done by all, then it's wrong. Another version of the categorical imperative that we were just getting to at the end, version 2. So categorical imperative version 2. The second version says, never treat a human being as a means to an end, but always as an end in itself. So, sorry, let me see if I had an issue putting that in the chat. Let me just do a test to see if it's going to show up. Can I do a quick check with you guys? Because I'm having a little error issue with my chat interface. Can you hear me right now? If so, please confirm real quick that nothing's wrong with your ability to see and hear me. Okay, so I'm not sure exactly why I'm being blocked from typing. I think there must just be a little glitch. Therefore, I'm going to put some notes on the board to overcome that little hurdle. Thank you guys for letting me know. Just one more try. Yeah, so not to worry. We're all good. I have a lot of fallback methods. So I'm going to put this on the board because, we have a board. So categorical imperative, I'm just abbreviating it with the letter CI, version 2. Never treat a human being as a means to an end, But always as an end in itself. So it's the word two, write that a little more legibly. So I hope it's legible enough. I'll read it back. You've got it on tape anyway. So here's what it says. Categorical imperative version 2. Never treat a human as a means to an end, but rather always treat humans as an end in themselves. So let's remind or remember what it is to have, what is a means and what's an end. You may remember, based on our earlier discussion from the mill and the utilitarianism, that an end is a goal or an objective, and means are the things that one does or the actions that one takes in order to attain whatever these goals are. So let me give you an example just really quick. Suppose I have a goal of running a marathon under 3 hours. That's a pretty elite time. You'd have to be running at like a 6-minute 51 pace for the entire 26.2 miles. Anyways, suppose that I have that goal, that's my end. What the means are that I might take towards that end would be like my training methods, my sleep schedule, my dietary habits, and etc. Those would be the actions taken towards the attainment of that end. If you want to become wealthy and that's your goal, maybe one of the means that you take towards that is to get a degree to place you in a nice career or field and so on. So anyway, what this is saying is when you are interacting with other human beings, you owe human beings respect and dignity because they're rational creatures like yourself. They're fellow legislators of the moral law that can comprehend right and wrong. So in order to respect human beings, you're never supposed to treat them as though they were mere tools to be manipulated in the pursuit of whatever goals that you may have. So instead of that, you should treat a human being as though they are the goal for the sake of which you're acting. What that means is that you're forbidden from all actions that involve like force, fraud, exploitation, or manipulation that would use another person for gaining a benefit for yourself at their expense. So like take, for example, if I was rerouting the power system of the electrical circuits from my neighbor's home, from my home to my neighbor's home. So basically that means that they're gonna pay all of my electrical bills. I'm now becoming a free rider off of their payment for the bill. If I rigged my appliances and household electricity to show up on their bill, I would be exploiting them and I would be using them as a means to what end? To what end? To the end of me saving money. But that takes advantage of them as a person and they didn't consent to their role in the interaction. So that's wrong. If I steal from a person and I engage in theft, then my goal is the attainment of the stolen item or valued item. And the means that I'm taking are, depriving the other person of their property in order to get that without their consent. So here again, it's violating the second version of the categorical imperative. You're not supposed to treat people as tools or things to be manipulated. They're not objects, they're subjects. If, let's say, God forbid, there was a terrible mass type shooting, public shooting incident, and everyone's running for safety, imagine that during that you're unfortunately on the scene and you're running for safety and hiding to try and protect your life. Suppose there was a person there even bigger and stronger than you who got up behind you and grabbed you like so and put yourself in front of them as they move through the scene. I'm giving you an example of someone that would recruit another person's body as a human shield to prevent them from incoming, bullets or shrapnel. Now, what's their goal in that example, or end, in other words? Of course, it would be the end of survival. But it would be wrong to do that because you're using a person's body as the means to attain that end. And here again, there's no consent that's been given by the person in order for you to do that to them. So it would be wrong for anyone to do that to you. But on the same token, if you're the one that's performing an action, you also have to treat other people with equal respect. So you're not supposed to treat them as a means either. It's a disgusting example, but let's take the case of rape for one. As you know, this is by definition a forced act of sexual interaction that's not consented to. In the case where one did this action, the violator, the perpetrator, their goal anyway is some kind of perverse sexual pleasure from the act. The means that they take is the other person's body bypassing their consent. And here again, they've been used as a means to an end that they didn't agree with. So if you want to make sure that you don't violate this second version of the categorical imperative, it has been said that you need to ensure that you don't ever intentionally engage in an action with another person for your benefit that they would not consent to if they had full information. So I'm going to put that in. Well, let's see if I can let me test this again. Yeah, it's not working, my chat. By the way, you're not seeing the typed comments that I'm attempting to put in there, right? In the chat, it's blank, right? Pretty much from your end. You can let me know, but I'll start writing this here. I'll tell you what it means to treat another person as a means in another sort of more informal way of putting it. Google Doc. Sorry, no. You treat another person as a means when you involve them in an interaction that they would not consent to. So you got to take the notes. So I wrote it, and I'm going to read it back. I know there's a couple of glares. Let's see if I can change that a little bit. It might be slightly better. But yeah, you treat another person as a means when you involve them in an interaction that they wouldn't consent to if they had full information, at least. So that's what you have an obligation to never do. Never involve another person in an interaction for your benefit that they wouldn't agree with or that they wouldn't give full consent for. Now, there are certain cases where two people or whatever can be mutually useful to one another, and it's not treating each other as a means because it's all authorized by the consent of the people in the interaction. As an example, if I buy like a coffee at Starbucks, I pay the money for the coffee and the barista makes my drink. In that example, my end or goal is to receive the drink so that I can have a nice caffeinated beverage. Am I using the employee as a means because they have to make the drink for me, or is it not treating them as a means? What do you say to that? There's an answer, and it's related to this point here, but I'm just making sure that you can kind of follow that. You're not treating them as a means, no. And the reason for that is because although they're helping you with the drink and they're serviceable to your end, they haven't been used as a means because they what? Let me know. They agree. They consent to their role in the interaction. They're working at will. Obviously, they're not working there against their will. It's not like they're enslaved and forced, regardless of what they want to do, to be serving drinks and tending the counter. So people work at will. They can walk off the job site anytime, really, if they don't like what they're doing. Therefore, since they consent to their role in the interaction, even though they're useful to me in that situation, it's not being used as a means. Take the perspective of Starbucks, the company. Their goal is to have a paying customer buy a drink so that they can profit off of the transaction. You know, they set the prices, so obviously they know that there's going to be a margin of profit when they charge you for the drink. It costs them less to supply it and to, make it. Now, when I buy the drink, I guess I'm helping the company with their bottom line goal, which is to make money. Have I been used as a means, the customer, because their goal was to make money off of me and now I've given them money? I've helped them towards their end, but I'm not being used as a means. And again, what's the reason for that? You can just say real quick why I haven't been used as a means when I'm making these consumer purchases. Because I'm willing to buy and I consent to my role in the interaction. No one's pointing a gun at me or forcing me against my will to buy things that I don't want. If I'd rather have the money than the good or service, I could have withheld on the purchase. So these little interactions and such, though mutually beneficial to both sides of the interaction, they don't constitute violation of the categorical imperative because it's not a violation of the other person's will or consent. So long story short then, to finish with our topic of Kant, you should act, he says, from a sense of duty to follow the moral law, and that's expressed by the categorical imperative in those two different versions. On the one hand, you should only act on principles that could be universal. On the other hand, when you deal with other human beings, you shouldn't treat them as something to be manipulated for your own purposes at their expense, and that basically amounts to not doing things with or to them that they wouldn't consent to if they had full information. Now, one last point. We talked about objections to the mill. We talked about, when we talked about utilitarianism, that, okay, according to the theory anyway, it might be very demanding. Maybe some people think that it's a theory for swine because it's all about pleasure, even though Mill tries to address that with a higher, lower pleasure distinction. Other people say that a problem with the theory is that no action in principle can be absolutely forbidden because as long as it maximizes utility or pleasure, it would be counted by the theory as morally permissible. And of course, we talked about potential situations in which either theft or lying or cheating, killing even, could have been an act that would have maximized utility. Now, one second, really quick. I just want to, but anyway, let me continue with that point before I do something, because I want to, in a separate window, try and see if I can get more of the members to come here. I'm not sure if everybody's present. I don't know if people are waiting for me to like tell them that the class is meeting, but it always meets from 4 to 5:15. So those that are not present, you need to be here. Anyway, though, there are also some objections that can be made against Kant and Kant's moral philosophy. But one thing that's interesting about his view is that it doesn't suffer some of the same problems that the utilitarians does. It has its own problems, but it's not the same as what utilitarians have. So like this issue with the transplant scenario that I gave you before, where we said, okay, imagine that there's 5 people with different failing organs and they all need different organs, but they all have the same blood type. So suppose then that there was one healthy young person that had the matching blood type and they're not willing to give them up to save these 5 people. Wouldn't it be wrong, don't you think, to kill the one person to save the 5? But according to utilitarian ethical theory, there's no like exact reason given why that would be wrong, because it would, after all, result in more total surviving people. Now, in Kant's moral philosophy, let's see if you can figure this out. Would it be okay to kill the one to save the 5 as given in the transplant scenario, or would it not be okay? And if it's not okay to Kant and Kantian ethics, tell me why. The same scenario of the transplant case, which was a problem for utilitarians, it would not be okay to the Kantian. And the reason is because, well, you can say it's that the person doesn't consent to the interaction, but even more basically, looking at the second version of the categorical imperative, you would be treating that other person, if you killed them for their organs, as a means. You'd be treating their body and their organs as a means to what end? To the end of saving 5 other people. But as Kant argues, a human being is never supposed to be treated as a means. They're supposed to be treated as the goal for the sake of which you are acting. So you can't like use a human being as though they were a source of spare parts, like a car at the junkyard. And so there's a lot of interesting aspects of how that protects against violations of basic human rights. If I could torture one person to like get information that would save a greater number of people, the utilitarian might say it was okay. But in Kantian world, that would not be okay, because you'd be treating the one victim of torture as a means to the end of attaining that information. Even if it was a lot of benefit that would come from it, Kant doesn't care about the maximization of utility. Instead, he just thinks that we ought to adhere to the moral law and the categorical imperative. Well, here's a problem though for Kant. So the major objections that I see most people make to Kant's moral philosophy is that if you were really going to follow Kant, then it would be very demanding on you in certain cases, because it wouldn't give you the flexibility to deviate from a moral rule, even if it was abundantly clear that that would result in the best consequences. Suppose that you're harboring a fugitive of justice, but this person's actually done nothing wrong. Suppose they've just been persecuted by an unjust legal regime. Like, say you were giving safe harbor to a Jewish person during the Nazi Holocaust, and according to like the Nazi laws, they were going to try to, seize all these people and, exterminate them. So say an officer came to the person's home that's giving that person, like a Anne Frank character, a safe harbor refuge in their attic, and they say, do you have any such people in your house? Now, at that point, the homeowner can either lie, no, I do not, sir, or they could tell the truth. Okay, you want to know? Yes, I do, in the attic. Now, probably most of us have the feeling that it would be better for you to lie in that case, because by lying, you're in all likelihood going to spare their life or prevent them from being killed, which is going to create more total happiness. Telling the truth in this case is likely going to result in their death, imprisonment, torture, whatever, and that would be bad for human happiness. But Kant, being so high-minded in his adherence to the moral law, he would say that you cannot universalize the maxim associated with lying in order to protect a person, because if that was universalized, then lying would become the rule rather than the exception, and then lies wouldn't even be believed in the first place, so the action would contradict itself if made universal. So to Kant, even if there was a little innocent enough example where you think, okay, here I probably should lie, or maybe here it's okay for me to like perform a minor act of theft, Kant doesn't envision scenarios where that's ever permitted, because again, he doesn't care whether the most happiness results from your action, only whether the action is based on a principle that can be done universally. So to some, there's a certain flexibility in the utilitarian ethics that may be seen by others as a weakness, but it could be seen as a strength in some of these cases. When we talk about a forced choice scenario, the demandingness objection of utilitarian theory, if there was like 2 people in a burning building and you know them dearly, and 10 people in another burning building, but you have no knowledge of who they are, the utilitarian would say, okay, now you have to save the greater number because there's more people. To Kant, though, you'd be allowed to save the lesser because the maxim that you're acting on is not actually contradictory. If the maxim was like, I will save a loved one when I have an opportunity to do that, then if that was universalized, that wouldn't result in any kind of logical contradiction. So just giving you some of the ins and outs of how the theories are different and what their competing strengths and weaknesses may be. But having said that, I'm going to really quickly try to see if I can send a quick Canvas message to some of our other students. I just want to see if there's a way to make sure that we have full attendance, because I insist that we don't allow that to drop off. So just give me 2 seconds. I'm just posting something real quick. It's just going to be a little cut and paste of the last posted notice, but I really want to stop having to do that. Anyway, one moment. It'll just take me 2 seconds. Okay, there we go. Sorry, it just took me 1 second. Cool, we're all still together. Hopefully so. Good. Testing the little chat function again, and yeah, that one's not working for me today. Next time it'll be back. Okay, so guys, now we're ready to move on to something new. We haven't yet gotten into the real moral issues, and that's actually the major substance of this class. But you have to have a foundation in ethical theory so that when you're talking about these moral issues, you have like a framework to analyze them. So anyway, the first big issue that we're all going to now look at in detail is abortion. And we're going to be spending a couple weeks on this, so, you know, get comfortable with the topic. It's going to be our subject matter for a little while here. Yeah, abortion. So I'm going to just kind of start by walking you through the general history of the topic and some interesting statistics and empirical data. And then we'll move on into the writing of Mary Ann Warren, which is our first author on the topic. And she's a pro-choice author, so she argues for the moral permissibility of abortion. So abortion is a divisive topic with a pretty long history. Our goal right now is to sort of get a general introduction to the issue, as well as to study one of our authors on the subject. So the act of abortion, as you obviously know, is something that's divisive morally. Some people think that it's morally wrong, in other words, morally impermissible, and other people do not think that it's morally wrong, that it's morally permissible. The first author that we read is going to be on the pro-choice side of the debate. So she does argue that the act or practice is morally permissible and should also be legally permitted. But by the time we're done, you know, we'll have all the balance. We'll see authors from both sides offering their different perspectives and arguments as to whether the act is morally permitted or not. But before we jump into those arguments, I first wanted to consider with you guys the overall history of the debate and how we've arrived at this moment in history regarding abortion. So first off, abortion is not actually a new practice at all. It's been practiced since ancient times. You can find references to the act of abortion going all the way back thousands of years ago to the writings of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Here's one of his quotations that's on page 118 of our textbook. Let there be a law that no deformed child shall live, and if couples have children in excess, let abortion be procured before life and sense have begun. So that's just a quote of Aristotle from like 2,200 years ago expressing basic support for abortion. The Bible, you know, contemporary Christians, especially the Catholic denomination, generally don't agree with the morality of abortion or think that it's wrong. But it's interesting to notice that it's a little bit more ambiguous if you look in the text of the Bible itself, particularly some of the Old Testament scriptures. Going back to the writings of the book of Exodus, at page 118 of our textbook, we can find Exodus 21:22 says that if a man causes a woman to have a miscarriage, but she is not harmed in any other way, the penalty is just a fine. And in the same chapter of the Bible, Exodus chapter 21, it talks about the Ten Commandments where it says, thou shalt not murder. So if thou shalt not murder is one requirement under the Bible or the Christian tradition, but another one says that if a man causes a woman to have a miscarriage, but she's not harmed in any other way, then she should only be fined. Then it would seem that, you know, you could interpret that to mean that the act of causing a woman to have a miscarriage does not constitute murder, because the biblical penalty for murder was supposed to be death, but the biblical penalty, at least written in Exodus 21:22, for causing a woman a miscarriage was only like some kind of financial penalty. But again, like I've said, and I'm sure as you know, contemporary Christians, especially in Catholic variety of Christianity, have generally condemned the act. Today, Catholics do believe that the unborn fetus is a person with full rights from the moment of conception. But that hasn't even been a constant throughout the entire history of the Catholic or Christian church. If you go back to the 12th century, the medieval time, the doctrine they had back then was that the embryo within the womb didn't have a soul until it achieved a human form, like a human shape, a recognizable human shape. This was the doctrine of what they called ensoulment. And Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived back in the 1300s, 1200s, or 1300s, he accepted this doctrine of ensoulment, but it's kind of revealing the sort of, I guess you could say, latent sexist attitudes that existed in much of world history prior to like the last couple of hundred years, or even the last 100 years, that the doctrine of ensoulment, according to what Aquinas wrote, was that the male fetus achieves human form at 40 days into gestation, and that the female fetus achieves the human form at 90 days into gestation. So that means that they were willing to grant at least twice as much time for a female fetus to be aborted than for a male. Now, I don't think they had reliable methods for determining the gender of a developing fetus at that time in world history. So a lot of this would have been guesswork and speculation, but it just shows that the full-blown doctrine that all abortions are wrong from the very first moment of pregnancy all the way through the end, that hadn't always been the standard. In 1312, this ensoulment doctrine was the official church doctrine. It was only in the late 19th century, only in the late 1800s, that the Catholic Church made a decision that ensoulment occurs right away at conception, and therefore that all abortion would be considered equivalent to murder. Let's consider some statistics about abortion that are written in our textbook on page 119. Some of these are interesting facts to just think about. So the relatively recent past, but in the past few decades, these statistics were given from data collected by the Alan Guttmacher Institute. In 2008, 1.2 million abortions were performed. These are from United States data. So in the United States in 2008, 1.2 million abortions were performed. In the year 2000, 1.3 million abortions were performed. So there's actually some trend of declining total numbers if you look at the data over the past, let's say, 20 years. Most Western industrialized countries actually have lower abortion rates than the United States does. So as much as there's a lot of heated debate and controversy over the topic in our country, we actually have more abortions than many other industrialized nations where the standards or the moral controversy is not as intense. Almost half of all pregnancies are unintended, meaning that a planned pregnancy where people decided to get pregnant and intentionally did so is about a 50-50 in terms of all pregnancies that happen. So about half of them are unplanned. But out of those unplanned pregnancies, 4 out of 10 of them end in an abortion. So like 40% of the 50% quotient of all pregnancies do end in abortion because half of all pregnancies are unintended, and out of those half, 40% will result in an abortion. Every year, and again, these are United States data, every year approximately 2% of women between the ages of 15 and 44 have an abortion. So, I mean, that's not a huge statistical percentage, but it's a significant one. It's, 1 out of 50 people between the ages of 15 and 44, women, of course, those are the childbearing years pretty much, have an abortion. 37% of women having abortions say that they're Protestant Christians. 28% of them say they're Catholic. So despite the, I guess, generally negative attitudes within Christian church towards abortion, upwards of a third of women getting an abortion are Protestants, 28% Catholics, and of course, if you add those two numbers together, that's more than 50% of the total number of people getting abortions. But in a nation where over 70% of people overall are Christian, I guess this is not necessarily to be too shocking. 54% of women who have abortions had used contraception during the month they became pregnant. So sometimes there's this misconception that people who seek abortion were irresponsible with their birth control. But even though that can be the case, over slightly more than half of women who had abortions had some kind of contraceptive method that failed. The risk of death associated with abortion is 1 death per 1 million abortions when it's performed at 8 weeks or earlier, 1 death in 29,000 abortions when it's performed between 16 to 20 weeks, and 1 death per 11,000 abortions when they're performed 21 weeks or later into the pregnancy. So what you're seeing there is that if an abortion is performed, the percentage chance of the woman having fatal complications from the abortion procedure are much lower at the earlier phases of pregnancy. It's like, one in a million when it's done prior to 8 weeks, one out of 29,000 when it's performed between 16 to 20 weeks. So as you get closer to the delivery date, the abortion procedure gets slightly more complex and therefore a little bit more risky for the woman doing it. Less than 0.3% of women having abortions suffer medical complications requiring hospitalization. So even though it's possible, it's a small percentage in total numbers. And over 15% of women who have abortions are in their 20s, and 18% are teenagers. So 68% of people getting abortions are either in their 20s or in their teens. So just reviewing some of those stats, it's just something I thought would be worthwhile because it's in our book. Now, in the British common law, so America originally was like a colony of Britain, of course, prior to the American Revolution, and therefore we inherited a lot of the British law standards that existed before, America really got rolling. And so the British common law gave a sort of legal precedent for how abortion was treated in the early eras of the United States. So when America was first founded, we just adopted the British rules. And the rule under the British law was that abortion was only considered illegal if it was done after the moment in pregnancy that's called quickening. So let me ask you guys if you've ever heard of this word. So this is just an event that's related to the process of pregnancy, quickening, like the word quick with just ending at the end. Anybody ever heard of this? Do you have any knowledge? It's okay if you don't. I'll definitely tell you, but I just wondered. Ever heard of it? You know what it might mean? What's this mean when you're during a pregnancy, you reach a point where there's so-called quickening? Okay, I'm seeing some no's, and that's fair enough. Let me just go ahead and tell you. Quickening is the point within pregnancy where a woman can detect fetal movement of the fetus within. So what I wrote is quickening. When the bearer, sometimes they say just mother, but in some cases this is a little presumptuous because some women with a pregnancy don't necessarily intend to become a mother for the exact reason they may want an abortion. So anyway, quickening is just a phrase or word that is referring to the point in pregnancy where the woman can now detect movement of the fetus, like, when people say, oh, I can feel the baby kicking and so on. So in the British common law, if you performed an abortion prior to quickening, they thought that that would be legally valid and permitted. But they had the standard that post-quickening, the fetus was too developed or whatever, and therefore it would be illegal to have aborted after that event. In early American law, this was our own standard, that it would only be illegal after quickening, except in the rare circumstance where it's necessary to save the mother's life. But over the next, 100 and some odd 50 years, the laws became more and more strict. And eventually, as we got to the turn of the 20th century, all abortions were banned unless the life and sometimes the health of the mother was at risk. But by the time we reached the 1950s, so the middle of the previous century, of course, there was a reversal of that trend of stricter and stricter laws and advocacy. We started to see major medical organizations like the American Medical Association advocate for less severe policies. And so by 1970, there was a broad discussion happening within society as to whether the laws regarding abortion were too strict. This led to the landmark 1973 Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision. And I'm sure some of you guys have heard about that case. It's been mentioned much in the news because the decision was reversed just recently in 2022, I believe, under the Dobbs decision of this current Supreme Court. But 1973 was the whole Roe versus Wade landmark court decision. Now, after the Roe versus Wade decision for 50 years almost until 2022, the standard changed. It said that it wasn't post-quickening that abortion would be potentially restricted, but after what's called viability. And that's just another event that occurs within pregnancy that I also want to see if you can tell me what you know about it. Maybe you've heard of it, I don't know. Otherwise, I'll tell you. But what do you think could be viability? It's another marker along the way towards delivery of a fetus. Ever heard of it? Maybe, maybe not. I'm sure probably most of you haven't. You say live. Okay, good, Jimin. That's kind of in the same ballpark. When the baby can live on its own, actually good. You guys do seem to know. So that's right. Viability is the word that refers to at the point in pregnancy where the baby, the fetus, could survive outside of the womb. Like, for example, in an incubation machine that they sometimes use for premature births. So the point at which the fetus could survive outside the womb. In other words, it's viable at that point. So that's viability for you. It's the point where the fetus could theoretically or potentially survive outside of the womb. Now, under the Supreme Court Roe versus Wade decision, they said that prior to viability, no state can enact a law that restricts access to abortion services. But post-viability, they allowed the state to take an interest in the developing fetus such that some restrictions could have been legally created. Now, let me go a little bit further into the detail of the stages of pregnancy, because that's also something important to kind of know as we're getting into this topic. Sorry, one second. Okay, yeah. So obviously the first event during pregnancy is sometimes called fertilization. Other people call it conception. What do you think that first event is? Fertilization, aka conception, is when what happens? It's the first moment, of course. So logically thinking about it, you probably can figure this out. There's no pregnancy prior to that. It's the fertilization of the egg, correct. It's the moment at which the sperm gamete fertilizes the egg gamete. So it's when the male and female gametes join, and now we have a fertilized egg in the womb. So conception is first. After that, for 3 to 5 days, the zygote, because at first we called this fertilized sperm-egg combination a zygote. For 3 to 5 days after that, the zygote moves down the fallopian tube to the uterus. It then divides. It starts to undergo cellular division. So it starts off as a single-celled fertilized egg. Then 3 to 5 days pass as it moves down the fallopian tube to the uterus. Then it starts to divide, and then it becomes what's known as a blastocyst. So just a couple of terms here. So there's the fertilization, that's one. Then there's the 3 to 5 days. Moves down to uterus, starts to divide into what's called a blastocyst. That's the new term that's given to it. blastocyst, blastocyst. Then it implants into the uterine wall, and it becomes what's scientifically or medically called an embryo. This embryo stage lasts for 8 weeks. And during that time, the first 8 weeks of pregnancy, the first rudimentary external features of the fetus start to take form. So it's like starting to take on the human form a little bit. And you start to see the first development of the organs, the internal organs, the brain and the spinal column. Now, after the 8th week until birth, it's given the label of fetus. But much of the philosophical writings and everyday discussion of pregnancy and abortion just refer to all stages of pregnancy as the fetus. So, I mean, there's actually a little bit more granular detail if you talk about it medically. We talk about the zygote, the blastocyst, then the embryo, and then the fetal stage. But we'll just, for simplicity, refer to all stages of pregnancy from conception till delivery as a fetus, just because that's how much of our authors talk about it anyway. Now, at the 14th week in pregnancy, we can determine the biological sex of the fetus. Between the 16th to 20th week, the mother can start to feel fetal movement, the quickening that we talked about earlier. So that happens at around, let's say, the 16th to 20th week. That's around like the 4-month mark of pregnancy quickening. So the old British common law standard that was the original standard for the United States, I guess, imposed a rule that post-quickening, so like basically post the 4th month roughly, abortion would have been restricted. Viability that we just talked about, the stage or point at which the fetus could survive outside of the womb if extracted, that occurs at around the 23rd and 24th week. So that's like roughly the end of the 5th month or starting to get close to the 6th month. And the process of pregnancy, also known as gestation, it's divided into 3 basic trimesters. So there's 3 trimesters of pregnancy that I don't know if you've heard of, but the 3 trimesters are like these phases of time. So the first trimester of pregnancy is from the 0 to the 12th week. The second trimester of pregnancy is from the 13th week till the 24th week. And then the third trimester of pregnancy is from the 25th week until delivery. So when we talked about how viability under the Supreme Court ruling was the marker after which a state was allowed to restrict access to abortion, that kind of aligns with basically the end of the second trimester, the beginning of the third trimester. So third trimester abortions, even under the Roe versus Wade decision, were considered something that the state doesn't have to necessarily restrict in all cases. It's possible for a person to get a late-term abortion in some states, but some of the more conservative states would have placed heavy restrictions on any access to that, except maybe for the sake of the woman's life. Abortion, of course, the word refers to the ending of a pregnancy. There have been some terminological discussions of a distinction between induced abortion as opposed to spontaneous abortion. Spontaneous abortion is basically an unintended miscarriage. So to avoid confusion with that concept, I'm just going to refer to abortion throughout our discussions as the deliberate, intentional desire to end a pregnancy. So intentional termination of pregnancy, induced abortion. We're just going to refer to abortion under that label because I think that's what most people understand it by anyway. Some other statistics related to this on page 121. When people are surveyed as to their reasons for getting an abortion, a survey of women in America that got abortion were giving these reasons by percentage. So 74% gave the reason that having a baby would change my life, for example, interfere with education, employment, or etc. 73% gave the reason I cannot afford a baby now, so it gave a financial reason, either because they're unmarried, unemployed, or destitute. By the way, you might wonder, well, how could there be 74% on one explanation, 73% on another? Doesn't that add to more than 100? Yes, because they allow people multiple different responses. So in the questionnaire, you could check multiple boxes. Another factor, 48% gave the reason because I don't want to be a single mother because I'm having relationship problems. So the fear that they won't have a stable partner to provide co-parenting with or to be the father. 11% gave the reason that I did it because my relationship or marriage may soon break up. So even though they have a relationship, they anticipate it ending. 38% gave the reason I've already completed my childbearing. So you can imagine the case of a person who's already had children, does not intend to have more, became pregnant, and doesn't want to pursue the pregnancy full term. 14% gave the reason my husband or partner wants me to have an abortion. So under the request or, I guess, demand of the partner that's unwilling to, let's say, be a parent. And 13% gave the reason there are possible problems affecting the health of the fetus. So, maybe there's an unhealthy pregnancy where the fetus is not bound to develop in a healthy way. So 13% gave that reason. This is the smaller statistical percentage, of course. 12% gave the reason there are physical problems with my health. 1% gave the reason I was a victim of rape, and less than half of 1% gave the reason that I became pregnant as a result of incest. So a lot of discussion is sometimes made about the exceptions to strict abortion prohibitions, like the exception of the life, health of the mother, or if it was a result of incest or sexual assault. But as you can see from these stats, that's actually a vanishingly small percentage, at least the case of either rape or incest. But nonetheless, it occupies a lot of attention in media and other discussions of it. So I want to say a little bit more to you guys about the Roe versus Wade court decision, just because we're talking about this topic now. Some of you may have heard of it, but I don't know. Have any of you ever known that the actual name of the plaintiff that brought the case is not Roe? Roe is just a legal pseudonym that was given to protect the person's identity, because as you can imagine, with the highly charged moral positions that people feel towards this issue, revealing or disclosing her name outright could have made her the subject of threats, retaliation, intimidation, harassment, So that's why her court docket was listed as Jane Roe. Have you ever heard people use the name John Doe as a generic name for a person whose identity that's not been revealed or that you don't want to reveal? The female equivalent of that is Jane Roe. Actually, her name is Norma McCorvey. And that's now we all know that, so the facts have all been revealed. So Roe versus Wade was Norma McCorvey versus Wade County, Texas. And so she wanted to end her pregnancy, and Wade, Texas, at the time was not going to legally permit that. So she got a lawyer and took her case to court, and it went through the courts all the way up to the highest federal level of the Supreme Court. And under the 1973 Supreme Court, they made the decision that the U.S. Constitution under the 14th Amendment grants a sphere of personal privacy to people in which the state cannot interfere. And they decided at that time that this sphere of personal privacy should be including a woman's decision whether to continue with her pregnancy or not, that the state can't interfere in the private decision that the woman makes on that basis. They derived that from the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution. So after that, their decision stood, and they said that the exception to the access to abortion in all 50 states, because this is a Supreme Court federal decision, not a state decision, they said it can't be restricted, at least not until after viability. After viability, they said, well, the state may regulate it unless it's in the specific scenario of the life or health of the mother. Now, the more conservative attitude towards abortion is obviously that it's never permitted, or that maybe it rarely is if it's to save the mother's life or health. The more liberal position is that it's always permissible whenever the woman wants it for any reason, because the unborn is not a person and does not have rights, including the right to life. And there are moderates that are in between, saying that some abortions are morally permitted and not others. And we're going to, examine all of these different arguments. So as we get started with the literature on the topic, we're going to look at the first of our authors, Mary Ann Warren, an important pro-choice author that wrote a classic essay on this topic. About Norma McCorvey's sort of last words, just it's an interesting footnote. As the years passed, she actually totally flipped her view. So by the way, Jim, and I should say this because some of my notes were written before the 2022 decision. After 2022, the Dobbs decision of the current Supreme Court ruled that the Roe versus Wade decision was inaccurate or incorrect to the U.S. Constitution, so they overturned it. And because they overturned it, there's no longer a federal right to abortion in all the states. So that delegates to the states the authority to make their own decisions whether the act is legal or not. In the blue states, like California, for example, our state, you have full access to abortion, and you could even get a late-term abortion under the proper circumstances. But in many states, the red states, for example, there have been some very punitive laws established since the decision came down, which can make it a crime punishable by certain, sentencing, either for the woman or more likely the provider of the abortion service or procedure. So yeah, since 2022, it's no longer considered a federal right under the U.S. Constitution, at least until the Supreme Court maybe someday chooses to revisit this under a different makeup of the Supreme Court. But for the time being, that's the case. Some legislators and, say President Biden had talked about codifying the right to abortion by legislation. Because for the whole 49-year period that the Roe versus Wade decision stood, there was no law passed by Congress that tried to enshrine abortion rights into law. They just said, well, the Supreme Court's already decided that it's unconstitutional to prohibit it, so we'll just rely on that ruling. But of course, the Supreme Court can overturn its previous decisions, and they did in 2022. It had been upheld numerous times, though, in the interim between 1973 and 2022, like in the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision in the 90s. They reaffirmed it, and they did that other times too. But we have a different Supreme Court now, and they had their different ruling. But yeah, so the author that we're starting with on this is Mary Ann Warren. Okay, Mary Ann Warren, and I just want to quickly look at her dates of life. I think that she passed away in 2010, but I forget the year that she was born, and I just kind of want to put that there so you have the information. Yeah, 1946 to 2010, that's her lifespan. So I'm just going to write that here. 1946 to 2010, Mary Ann Warren. Her article, which was published in 1972, and we're going to talk now about that article, it was called On the Moral and Legal Status of Abortion. So just giving you the author information, the title, and then her lifespan. Mary Ann Warren, On the Moral and Legal Status of Abortion. Yeah, and because this article was published in 1972, it was one of those, I say 1972, actually, 1973 itself. So it was 1973 publication date. Sorry, got that 1 year off. But it was published the same year as the Roe versus Wade decision. And that means that it was part of the intellectual climate that kind of helped this case reach the Supreme Court and then ultimately reach that kind of landmark decision. So there are a lot of philosophers, advocacy groups, people in academia and in the medical field that had been making the case that abortion laws at that time were too strict. So her paper maybe had somewhat of an influence indirectly by contributing to the intellectual climate of the time. So what's her big view? I'm going to sort of give you the overview, and then we're going to like get into the details. There's probably some time that we'll need to spend at the beginning on Thursday to wrap up everything from her, but you know, it's actually a pretty straightforward argument. So her basic view in this paper is that abortion is not wrong because the fetus throughout the entire period of pregnancy is not a person. She says it's not a person. It may be a human, that can't be denied. It's genetically a human, but it's not a person in the sense that we think of a person, you know, having reason, language, self-awareness, and all those other things. Throughout pregnancy, the developing human fetus is less person-like than, say, a common animal that may be used for food that we have no problem slaughtering and, you know, subjecting to all forms of, you know, mistreatment, really. So the concept of the fetus during the pregnancy, she argues, when you analyze the capacities that the fetus has, or when you compare it to full-blown rational adult human beings, that it's not a person yet. And she argues that to have rights that people have, you have to be a person. And at least for the early stages of human development, like during pregnancy, we have a human but not a person yet. So it's basically that idea. Just being a Homo sapiens, just being genetically a member of the human race, is not by itself sufficient for personhood status. That's her basic argument. There can be, as she argues, non-human persons, at least theoretically, there could be non-human persons. Suppose there were alien life forms far out somewhere in the universe on another planet, having their own intellectual discussions, technology, society, law. If there were, then she argues those would be persons just as much as us, and they should have the same kind of rights and recognition of like rights and duties that we have. So there could be potentially non-human persons. The concept of humanity genetically is not even a necessary condition for being a person, at least not theoretically. And she says there can also be non-person humans, the fetus being one example of that. But I don't know, another possible case could be a person in a permanent vegetative state. They're still human genetically, but if they have no brain activity and they can never have brain activity restored, then some people would say that there's nothing impermissible about discontinuing extraordinary life support measures, because you're ending the life not of a person any longer, but of a human being that's become like a vegetable or whatever. So what does make a human being a person, or what makes anything be a person? This is part of what she has to explain, and she tries to give an explanation in the paper. In her view, it has to do with 5 important criteria or traits that we'll discuss in a moment. And her main position is that if there's a human being that has none of these attributes that people have, then that's a human but not a person. Now, on the other hand, conservative thinkers and writers that oppose her argument may challenge it by saying that the criteria that she sets forth for being a person are too high, and that according to those criteria, not only fetuses would be disqualified from the moral community or having rights, but also certain, maybe even severely impaired individuals that don't have like higher thought or reason. And we'll see how she tries to contend with some of those objections, because she does, you know, discuss those as well. So anyway, in more detail now, the first thing that she asks the reader as she opens up the paper is, how can we define the moral community? The moral community. So this is a phrase that's used, and it's used by a lot of different authors that we'll talk about in our class. It's a phrase used in discussions of ethical philosophy. So the moral community. Now, the moral community is a phrase that it doesn't refer to like, oh, the community of people with nice morals and moral beliefs and, you know, etc. That's maybe what you would have thought at first. When you see the moral community, you're like, oh, the people who are all like good morally and such. It doesn't mean that, though. In the way that it's being used by these authors, it instead refers to the set of beings that have full and equal rights. Okay, so that's it. The set of beings with full and equal rights. So her opening question to the reader is, what defines the moral community? What is it, or what is required in order to be a member of that community, the member of the community of things that have full and equal rights? You know how in those founding documents of the United States, like Thomas Jefferson said that in like the Declaration of Independence, that human beings are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The question could be thought of along those lines, like what entities are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? What makes a being a member of that moral community? One claim, and perhaps the one that comes to some people's mind, is that all you have to do to be a member of the moral community, to have full and equal rights, is to be a genetic human being, to be a member of Homo sapiens, the human race. But she says that just being a member of human race is not by itself sole sufficient for being a member of the moral community. So how can we define that moral community? One suggestion is that it's anything that's human, but she says there's a problem with that suggestion. The problem is that the word human is ambiguous. It can be understood in at least two distinct ways. And to show the difference between two different meanings, or I guess senses of the word human, she provides us with a basic pro-life argument to try to deconstruct and expose as fallacious. So what I'm going to do then is right here on the board the basic pro-life argument that she's referring to, and then she's going to try to expose to the reader why she thinks this argument commits fallacies. Fallacies are when there's like a logical flaw or error within an argument, according to which the premises don't establish or don't imply the conclusion. So here's the basic pro-life argument that she wants to target and take aim at. Keep in mind, pro-life means that the person believes abortion's wrong. So she's trying to like identify the argument of her opponent so that she can kind of pick it apart. And here's that basic pro-life argument. So you may know this from previous studies in either critical thinking or philosophy or logic, but arguments, when they're diagrammed in philosophy or logic, they're often written in this standard format where you have premises and then a conclusion at the bottom. Within an argument, the conclusion is the claim or the statement that you're trying to prove to be true, and then the premises are the reasons that you give that's supposed to support that conclusion. So this is just a random example of an unrelated argument, but I'm just using it to give you a sense of what these concepts mean. Suppose that I was a lawyer and I was a prosecutor, and I was trying to show that somebody named Smith was guilty of murder. He's the person I'm trying to prosecute and convict. So I want the jury to believe that Smith's the killer. Suppose that I raise this argument in court. Smith's fingerprints were found on the murder weapon. Smith, in his phone that we recovered, he wrote of a detailed plan to kill Jones. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm telling you, therefore, Smith's the killer. And now, in that example, two reasons were given. His fingerprint was on the murder weapon, and he wrote in his phone that we hacked into that he intended to kill the supposed victim. And then the person that's the prosecutor says, okay, therefore, you should reach the conclusion that he's guilty. I'm just using that as an example. There's two premises there, and the conclusion was Smith did it. So to make the case that Smith did it, you have to give reasons, and those are what we call premises. Now, this basic pro-life argument has two premises, and they're the reasons that are supposed to support the conclusion of the argument, which is that abortion is wrong, or that it's wrong to terminate a fetus. So here's the basic pro-life argument that she's gesturing towards. First premise says, it is wrong to kill innocent human beings. Okay, that's premise one. Premise two, I'm listing them with the number at left so that you can clearly see where one premise is starting and ending, where the next one begins. The second premise then continues by saying that fetuses are innocent human beings. So the conclusion, therefore, there's this standard form of logical argument where there's often a horizontal line that will separate the premises above from the conclusion below. So you could probably figure out the conclusion just by thinking through it logically. Based on these two claims, there's something that follows deductively. The first premise says it's wrong to kill innocent human beings. The second premise then says that fetuses are innocent human beings. So simply stated, what's the conclusion of that argument then? Based on the premises, whatever they're saying, the conclusion would be what statement? If it's wrong to kill innocent human beings and fetuses are these innocent human beings, that means therefore that it is what? Let me know. Anybody can tell me when you're ready. That it's wrong to kill a fetus. That's right, Tyler. Yes. So therefore, it is wrong to kill a fetus. In other words, basically that's the same as saying abortion's wrong. Yeah. Now don't get lost. This isn't Warren's position because she's pro-life. Sorry, let me correct myself. She's pro-choice. Let's not get that confused. Mary Ann Warren believes that abortion is not wrong. So the only reason that she's raising this argument is to identify the position of her opponent. Therefore, she can try to show the faulty logic of the argument. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that. Mary Ann Warren is pro-choice. She's pro-choice. I don't want that to be confused. I'm sorry I misspoke, but it's just a one word. So anyway, this is the pro-life argument. Now she's saying, well, what's wrong with the argument? The problem that she sees is that the word human being, which is appearing in premise 1 and premise 2, it's being used in two different ways. It's being used in two non-identical meanings or definitions. And when that is the case, that means that this argument is committing what's called the fallacy of equivocation. So two different senses of the word human. Okay, so one of them she calls the genetic sense of the word human. The genetic sense. On the other hand, she calls the other sense what's known as the moral sense of the word human. Now, the genetic sense of the word human just refers to something that has human DNA. And that's very minimalist. So anything that has human DNA would be genetically human based on that definition of human. There have sometimes been these very unfortunate birth defects. Let's just use an example. Some fetuses have been born with no brain. This is a very rare condition, an encephalitic birth, but it can happen. It has happened. It's been documented. Now, this fetus that's been delivered with no brain at all, at least genetically speaking, though, it still has human DNA. And so in the genetic sense, that would still be a human. But there's another meaning behind the word human that she calls out, and that's the moral sense. The moral sense of the word human refers to something that's a member of the moral community with rights, like a full-blown member of the moral community with equal and full rights. So she thinks that this argument is conflating or equivocating between talking about humans in the moral sense versus talking about humans in the genetic sense. If we use the same sense of the word human being in both premise 1 and premise 2, then the argument will assume what is to be proved, which means that it would beg the question. So the first premise says, it is wrong to kill innocent human beings. For that not to already assume the conclusion, it has to be intended in the moral sense of the word. Because if it was equivalent to the statement that it's wrong to kill anything that's genetically human, that would amount to the statement that it's wrong to kill a fetus, which is the conclusion of the argument. And the premises of the argument are not supposed to say the same exact thing as the conclusion. They're supposed to be evidence of the conclusion or reasons that support it, but they're not supposed to be identical to it. Like if I told you that God exists, therefore God is real, this is a circular argument. That argument begs the question because the premise is that God exists, and what it's seeking to establish is that God is real, which is just synonymous with existing. So in order for this premise to not simply assume the conclusion's truth before we get to the conclusion, it must be intended in the moral sense of the word. So far, so good? Now look at the second premise. It says fetuses are innocent human beings. But if this is not going to just say that fetuses are members of the moral community and therefore they have the right to life, Jem, you asking me what is what called the fallacy that we just talked about? Let me go ahead and list that. So two fallacies that are being talked about right now. One is begging the question. And the other is called equivocation. Thank you. That's a good question. Now, begging the question fallacy is when a premise is just a reworded version of the conclusion. Okay? So if somebody says to you that, like in my previous example, let's give a new one. The death penalty is wrong, therefore the death penalty is immoral. That's a circular argument. This is another term that's sometimes used to refer to begging the question. Begging the question, circular argument, same concept, different labels. If I said to you that the death penalty is wrong because it's immoral to execute people by the state, that's not giving a different reason. It's just giving the same reason. It would be like saying the Lakers are the best team in basketball because no team's better than them. That's not telling you any reason. That's just saying the same thing in two slightly different ways. And so the argument goes in a circle, okay? For this premise to not already assume that it's wrong to kill any like human fetus, it has to be intended in the moral sense, because if it was intended in the genetic sense, it would be equivalent to saying that it's wrong to kill anything with human DNA, which would be the same thing as the conclusion is saying. So this must be stated in the moral sense to avoid begging the question. The second premise, though, has to be stated in the genetic sense to avoid begging the question. Because if we say that fetuses are members of the moral community, and we intended it in the moral sense, then that would be already saying that it's wrong to kill any fetus. So the first premise, it's wrong to kill innocent human beings, is only uncontroversially true if it's intended in the moral sense. Let me make that precise by putting a little note. This is regarded in the moral sense, and this one is regarded in the genetic sense. Because again, if we use the same sense throughout, then one of the two premises is going to beg the question of the conclusion. If this is the moral sense and this is the moral sense, then the premise 2 begs the question. If this is the genetic sense and this is the genetic sense, then premise 1 begs the question. So to avoid begging the question, they have to be using the term human in 2 different ways. But then we have another problem, which is that they're committing the fallacy of equivocation. So let me tell you what the fallacy of equivocation means. The fallacy of equivocation is committed when a key term within an argument is used more than once, but with different meanings. Notice that words in language have more than one definition in many cases. And if you use one word 2 times in an argument, but it means different things, then we say you are equivocating on the meaning of that word, and therefore the logical conclusion of the argument doesn't follow. Let me give you a different new example. Suppose that I were to tell you that John is at the bank, and a bank is a financial institution, so therefore John's at a financial institution. That argument seems credible on a first glance, but let's just try and problematize it a little bit. Let me write that over here, actually. So, yeah. I'm just gonna have to stand up for this 1 second. Okay, sorry for the bit of clutter here, but I'm just kind of marking off the argument here with that squiggly line to segregate it from the other content to its right. And I'll read it to you if there's a legibility issue, but it's just an example of a fallacy of equivocation. Zach, your question is, so for the 2 senses, genetic contains human DNA. What is the moral sense? Okay. The moral sense of human refers to a member of the moral community with full and equal rights, like a person, basically, but that anticipates something to come a little later. But the moral sense of human refers to a person, a member of the moral community, something that has full and equal rights. So something that has the right to life, something that has, in our society, when they achieve a certain age, the right to vote, the rights to life, liberty, and happiness, etc. A member of the moral community. So that's the moral sense. The genetic sense is just the baseline fact of having human DNA. The moral sense is this more elevated idea of having full rights. Okay, good question. Now, I'm just trying to explain the fallacy of equivocation with this example. We're running low on time, so we'll return to this and we'll wrap up Marianne Warren, probably 20, 30 minutes at the beginning on Thursday. But the argument, what I wrote says, John is at the bank, premise 1. The second premise says a bank is a financial institution, therefore, conclusion, John is at a financial institution. On a first glance, you'd say, fair enough, that sounds fair. But let's consider the word bank. The word bank can have more than one possible interpretation. One, of course, meaning of the word bank is like a financial bank, like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, where you go and you deposit money or you withdraw funds. But another meaning of the word bank that's unrelated to anything financial is, can you tell me something about that? Something else that has to, that the word bank can refer to that's totally unrelated to finance or money. There's a couple of them, really, but you'll tell me one of those. I had one in mind. Bank, not a financial bank, but a bank in what other sense? Just take 1 second while I wait for your response. Okay, good. Like you're saying the edge of a river. Good, Santino. That is exactly what I was thinking. Like a riverbank, you know, the Mississippi riverbanks. There's also an embankment, like a slope. Yes, there can also be a blood bank or a food bank. You know, many options. But let's just go with, to keep it simple, the financial bank, meaning number one, and on the other hand, the edge of the river, like the riverbank. Now, if premise one says John is at the bank, suppose that what we intended by that is that John's fishing at the edge of the river. He's at a bank in that sense. The second premise says a bank is a financial institution, which clearly implicates the other meaning of bank, the financial type bank. But if we're using the word bank in those two different and non-identical ways, does the conclusion follow any longer that John's at a financial institution? No, because in this case, we have equivocated on the meaning of that key term. So it's sort of a deceptive argument. I mean, this is not a very important argument. It's really just a trivial argument that we're using for teaching purposes, but I'm trying to teach the concept of equivocation. And then we'll apply that back to this when we resume next time. What she is saying is that this argument, similar to this one, has a key term in it that's being used in two non-identical ways. And in this case, it's not the word bank, but the word human being. In the first premise, where it says it's wrong to kill an innocent human being, it means that in the sense of like it's wrong to kill a member of the moral community that has full rights. Yes, that's true. The second premise, which says that fetuses are innocent human beings, cannot be asserting that fetuses are innocent members of the moral community because that would already presuppose the conclusion's truth. So this must be intended, to avoid begging the question, the genetic sense of the term. But now we have premise one using the moral sense, premise two using the genetic sense, and therefore the conclusion that it's wrong to kill a fetus doesn't follow. So, you know, that's the full breakdown, but in a more simple way of putting it, as I'm just closing the meeting right now, she's really saying that when people say, okay, it's wrong to kill a human, and a fetus is a human, so you shouldn't kill a fetus, they're talking about human in different ways. On the one hand, when they say it's wrong, they're talking about a person with rights. But when they say that the fetus is human, all they're really entitled to claim, without presupposing that it's got the moral status of like adult human beings, is that it's genetically human. So she thinks that the pro-life advocate has to make a stronger case. They have to establish somehow by argument that anything with human DNA is a member of the moral community. And that's where she does disagree. She thinks to be a member of the moral community, it takes more than just having mere human DNA. That having human DNA is neither necessary nor sufficient for being a member of the moral community. And we'll see what she does think constitutes membership in the moral community next time. It'll have to do with a cluster of attributes that she thinks is typical of persons that have rights. So I'll leave you in suspense a little bit, but now, you know, we started to tap into our first big moral controversy of the semester as we're learning about abortion and the authors who've discussed the morality of abortion. Appreciate you guys' attendance today, you know, like always, but I'm gonna have to close this one because we're a little over time. So yeah, go ahead. Thanks, Anthony. I appreciate you being here. Anybody, feel free to say goodbye. I'll close the stream in just a minute. And of course, you can find this same video by coming back to the channel anytime later. It's going to be posted right away. Okay, guys, thank you so much. We'll be getting to the essay prompts over the weekend. I'll post those, but we still need a little more topic discussion on abortion because it's related to that. So, okay, guys, thanks everybody that's here. Take it easy and stay safe. I'll see you guys on Thursday. Okay, bye-bye.